February 19, 1945. The island of Iwo Jima trembles beneath a curtain of smoke. The air is thick with the stench of sulfur and burning coral. From the black volcanic sand, shapes emerge. Silent figures in steel helmets, faces streaked with ash and blood. They are men of the Imperial Japanese Navy's elite, the Special Naval Landing Forces, Japan's proud Marines. They have sworn an oath to die where they stand. Every bunker, every cave is a tomb waiting to be sealed. Above them, the thunder of naval guns rolls like an endless storm, the U.S. Navy's prelude to invasion. For 72 days, they have prepared for this moment, carving tunnels deep into the island's volcanic core. They know what's coming, 1,000 ships, 100,000 Americans. But even as the black beach turns red and the island becomes a furnace of fire and death, they could not have imagined what the Americans would unleash next. Because this battle, this tiny speck of earth in the Pacific, would change warfare forever. Long before the black sands of Iwo Jima, the idea of a Japanese Marine Corps was born from empire and ambition. In the 1920s, as Western powers dominated the seas, Imperial Japan sought to forge its own image of maritime supremacy. The Special Naval Landing Forces, Rikusentai, emerged from this vision. Their purpose was simple but deadly: to seize and defend distant islands, coastal fortifications, and foreign harbors in the name of the Emperor. Unlike the U.S. Marines, whose creed combined discipline and adaptability, Japan's SNLF drew from a more ancient well, Bushido, the samurai code. Honor before surrender, death before capture, victory even in defeat. By the 1930s, as Japan expanded into Manchuria and the Chinese coast, the SNLF earned a reputation for ferocity. At Shanghai in 1932, they fought bitter street battles amid the shattered ruins of the city's international district. They were small in number, naval infantry in name, shock troops in spirit. They learned to operate without air support, to fight surrounded, to make every bullet and bayonet strike count. When war erupted across the Pacific in December 1941, these same units would lead the charge. From Guam to the Philippines, from Wake Island to Hong Kong, the SNLF spearheaded Japan's lightning conquests. Their amphibious assaults were swift and disciplined, often overwhelming garrisons before full alarm could spread. At Hong Kong, they stormed ashore under artillery fire, seizing British strongholds in brutal close-quarter combat. Each victory reinforced the myth that the Emperor's Marines were unstoppable, an unbreakable brotherhood bound by loyalty and death. Their training was merciless. Recruits were beaten for hesitation, drilled until exhaustion blurred the line between life and duty. Surrender was not an option. It was dishonor beyond death itself. Instructors told them, a soldier's spirit outlives his body. That spirit would be tested in the years ahead. As 1942 turned to 1943, the tide began to turn. The Japanese advance, stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, met a rising industrial giant, the United States. American carriers, submarines, and bombers strangled Japan's supply lines. Every island taken now became an island that needed defending. And no defenders were more trusted than the SNLF. They were sent wherever defeat seemed certain: Tarawa, New Guinea, the Solomons, not to win, but to die hard. In Tokyo, their sacrifice became propaganda. In the field, it became tragedy. Still, their commanders adapted. From direct assaults, they shifted to defense in depth, honeycombing islands with caves, tunnels, and interlocking fire zones. If the Americans wanted a beach, they would pay for every grain of sand. By 1944, the Japanese Empire was fighting a war it could no longer win. The once proud fleet lay shattered in the Philippine Sea. The home islands awaited invasion. Yet, even in this darkness, the SNLF's spirit endured. They became the embodiment of Japan's wartime psyche, unyielding, loyal, defiant to the last man. When word spread that the Americans were approaching the volcano islands, Iwo Jima, the call went out for the strongest defense yet. To command the garrison, Tokyo chose Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a man of intellect and empathy who had studied in the United States. He understood the enemy's strength better than anyone in Japan's high command. He told his men plainly, "We cannot win this battle, but we can make it so costly that America will tremble." For the SNLF, this was not defeatism. It was destiny. They began digging, Thousands of yards of tunnels, bunkers carved from volcanic rock, artillery hidden beneath the earth. No longer would they meet the Americans at the water's edge. They would let them land, then destroy them from beneath the ground. By early 1945, Iwo Jima had become more fortress than island. Inside its caves waited nearly 21,000 Japanese soldiers, Army and Navy alike, including remnants of the SNLF. They carried with them the same code, the same unbroken oath that had defined their existence since the first wars in China: fight to the end. Yet as they looked out across the Pacific horizon, seeing the distant silhouettes of 1,000 ships, even these veterans must have wondered, what could possibly stand against such power? That question would be answered in fire. By late 1944, the Pacific War had transformed from conquest to catastrophe for Japan. The once unbroken chain of islands stretching from Burma to the Central Pacific was being shattered, one link at a time. American forces, guided by a brutal simplicity, island hopping, no longer sought to capture every stronghold. They bypassed the isolated, starving garrisons and targeted only what was strategically vital. Each leap brought them closer to Japan's heart. The Mariana Islands fell that summer. Saipan, Tinian, Guam. After months of bloodletting, those battles were not merely tactical victories. They were psychological earthquakes. For the first time, the homeland lay within reach of the B-29 superfortresses, whose bombs could now strike Tokyo itself. Tens of thousands of Japanese civilians would soon learn what total war truly meant. At sea, Japan's proud navy, once the symbol of imperial might, was broken beyond repair. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, hundreds of aircraft were annihilated in what American pilots mockingly called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Imperial Navy's last major gamble, Leyte Gulf, ended in near annihilation. The remaining ships became fuel-starved ghosts adrift in a widening ocean. Yet the Japanese High Command refused surrender. Instead, it embraced death as strategy. A new word entered the world's vocabulary: kamikaze. From the Philippines to Okinawa, young pilots hurled themselves at American ships, believing that divine wind could still protect the Emperor's realm. It was the ultimate expression of Bushido twisted into national policy. Sacrifice is salvation. But the Americans were adapting faster than Japan could die. General Douglas MacArthur's land forces and Admiral Chester Nimitz's fleet converged from opposite directions, one through the Philippines, the other across Micronesia. Between them lay a small barren island of volcanic rock, Iwo Jima. Barely 8 square miles in size, the island held immense strategic value. It sat almost exactly halfway between the Marianas and the Japanese mainland. From its airfields, Japanese fighters intercepted American bombers. From its radar posts, they warned Tokyo of incoming raids. For the U.S. Army Air Forces, capturing Iwo Jima meant one thing: an emergency landing base for crippled bombers, and a staging point for the coming assault on Japan itself. In November 1944, American reconnaissance flights captured the first images of the island's defenses. What they saw was staggering: an underground fortress unlike anything encountered before. Japanese engineers under Kuribayashi's command had transformed the volcanic rock into a labyrinth. There were 11 miles of tunnels, hidden artillery, interlinked bunkers, and underground hospitals. Each position was camouflaged so well that even heavy naval bombardment would find little to destroy. Kuribayashi's orders were clear: no banzai charges, no wasteful dying. Kill 10 Americans before you die. It was a break from tradition, a cold strategic evolution within the same fanatic spirit. The SNLF, alongside army units and laborers, built these defenses by hand, enduring heat, fumes, and the omnipresent sulfur that made the island smell of rotten eggs. Every man knew his role in the coming apocalypse. On the other side of the Pacific, preparations were equally relentless. The U.S. had learned its lessons from Tarawa and Peleliu, battles where underestimating Japanese fortifications cost thousands of lives. For Iwo Jima, they assembled the largest amphibious invasion in the Pacific theater. Over 450 ships, 110,000 troops, and months of sustained bombardment. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions, veterans hardened by prior island wars, were chosen for the landing. Among them were men who had seen what Japanese Marines were capable of: the silent resistance, the ambushes that came from the ground itself. They carried new weapons: flamethrowers, demolition charges, and the monstrous M4A3 Sherman Zippo tanks, built to flush enemies out of tunnels with streams of fire. In early February 1945, the U.S. Navy began its pre-invasion bombardment. For 3 days, the island disappeared beneath clouds of ash and thunder. Admirals believed nothing could survive such punishment. But deep inside their tunnels, the Japanese listened, waiting, conserving their strength. To them, the Americans were not men but intruders into a sacred graveyard. Each Marine who landed would meet an enemy who did not intend to live through the encounter. And yet, among these Japanese Marines and soldiers, a strange mix of emotions lingered: duty, fatalism, and awe. They had seen photographs of American industry, heard tales of endless ships and planes. Some veterans whispered that this was no longer a war of soldiers but of nations, a struggle between belief and machinery. As dawn broke on February 19, 1945, the horizon filled with ships as far as the eye could see. Kuribayashi's men waited in silence, fingers on triggers, breath held in the sulfur-laden dark. When the first American waves hit the black sand, Japan's finest Marines did what they had been trained to do since Shanghai, since Hong Kong, since the first wars of empire. They fought. But what they were about to witness, what the Americans would unleash next, would shock even them. The human angle, the will to die, for the men of the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, the concept of survival had long been erased from their vocabulary. They were raised in a culture where surrender was a wound deeper than death. From childhood, they were taught that to die for the emperor was the purest act of existence. When the call came to defend Iwo Jima, many wrote farewell letters to families they would never see again. One Marine wrote, "If I fall, it is with joy. Tell my mother I did not die in vain." Another sealed a lock of hair in a small envelope, to be sent home with the words, "I return to you as wind." Inside the tunnels, these men lived like ghosts before they were dead. There was little light, almost no water. They rationed rice and rain, shared cigarettes, and whispered prayers to ancestors. They did not wait for rescue. They waited for immortality. Yet there was something profoundly human beneath their steel discipline. Many admired the Americans in private, their machines, their courage, even their music drifting across from ship loudspeakers. They knew this was an army unlike any they had fought before. Still, when the first U.S. Marines stepped onto the beach, the Japanese Marines raised their rifles and did what their code demanded. They fought not because they hated, but because they believed that dying well was the last gift they could give their country. The tactical angle, the art of the invisible defense, Iwo Jima was not defended like any other island. Previous battles had taught Japan's commanders that traditional defenses, bunkers on beaches, barbed wire, and frontal charges, were suicide. At Tarawa and Palaliu, entire garrisons had been annihilated within days. General Kuribayashi changed everything. He ordered his men to disappear, to fight not as soldiers on the surface but as shadows beneath the earth. From Mount Suribachi to the northern cliffs, a subterranean world took shape. Concrete tunnels, interconnected pillboxes, artillery chambers hidden behind steel doors. Snipers and machine gunners had overlapping fields of fire, able to hit the beaches crosswise instead of head-on. Every cave became a trap, every opening a lure. The plan was not to stop the landing, that was impossible, but to bleed the invaders dry meter by meter. When the U.S. Navy's bombardment began, Kuribayashi forbade any response. The Americans believed they had destroyed the defenders. But the moment the beach filled with Marines, the island exploded in gunfire. Mortars rained from invisible positions. Machine guns stitched the sand. Men fell where they stood, unable to find the enemy. The Marines realized they were not storming an island. They were entering a living fortress. It was defense as an art form, silent, patient, and merciless. For every foot gained, 10 lives were lost. And still the SNLF held fast, fighting without hope, guided by a single purpose: make the enemy pay. The technological angle, America's war of machines across the battlefield, a different kind of war was unfolding, one that symbolized the industrial age at its most devastating. The United States had turned technology into a weapon of inevitability. Every problem had an engineered answer. Every human obstacle, a mechanical solution. On the beaches, armored bulldozers carved paths through volcanic ash, while flamethrower tanks, the M4A3 Zippos, turned bunkers into infernos. The sound was otherworldly, the hiss of ignited napalm, the shriek of superheated air collapsing inside tunnels. Where the Japanese fought with courage, the Americans fought with fire. Above, carrier-based fighters strafed positions with rockets. Naval guns pounded from miles offshore, guided by spotter planes. Communications crackled with precision unheard of only a few years earlier. Radios linked platoons. Artillery and ships in perfect synchronization. The Marines advanced behind steel and science. And yet even they felt the cost. Flamethrower operators were among the most hated targets on the island. Many never survived their first day. The technology that gave them dominance also made them visible, loud, and vulnerable. But the most terrifying tool was time. Japan could not replace what it lost. Each machine destroyed meant another gap in the line, another fire that couldn't be answered. In the end, the Americans' true weapon wasn't napalm or tanks. It was endurance, powered by an industry that dwarfed the world. As the battle stretched from days into weeks, both sides began to glimpse the nature of modern war. One built not on valor alone but on systems, logistics, and infinite replacement. And yet, amid this clash of iron and spirit, something deeper was emerging. A strange, grim respect between enemies who refused to yield. The leadership angle, the mind behind the Mountain Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, was unlike any Japanese commander before him. He was not a fanatic. He was a realist. He had studied in Canada and the United States during the 1920s, had dined with American officers, and had seen Detroit's factories roar with life. He understood something that most of Tokyo's high command refused to see. Japan could not win a war of industry. Yet he accepted his command on Iwo Jima with calm determination. He knew the end was inevitable, but he also knew that how his men died could shape how long Japan would endure. Kuribayashi banned the suicidal banzai charges that had defined earlier battles. Instead, he chose patience and precision, forcing the Americans into a drawn-out nightmare that would cost them dearly. He wrote letters home filled with tenderness and pain. To his wife, he confessed, "Do not expect my return. Even if I die, my body will guard the homeland." To his men, his tone was different, firm but fatherly. He reminded them that their deaths were not meaningless, that every enemy soldier killed delayed the inevitable invasion of Japan's home islands. Beneath his command, Army and Navy units, often rivals, fought as one. The SNLF, usually arrogant in their naval pride, respected Kuribayashi's quiet authority. They called him the General Who Listens, a rare title in the imperial forces. While American commanders directed fleets from floating headquarters, Kuribayashi moved through the tunnels by lamplight, checking positions, speaking with soldiers, sharing their rations. He did not shout. He led by presence. In the final days, when communication collapsed and ammunition ran dry, his voice on the field radio was calm as ever. "You have fought bravely. Japan will remember you." And then the signal went silent. The enemy angle, the Marines who faced the unthinkable. For the U.S. Marines storming Iwo Jima, this was no ordinary enemy. They had faced Japanese forces before, on Tarawa, on Guam, on Peleliu, but nothing compared to what awaited them here. The first shock was the silence. The second was the precision. Every time a Marine unit thought it had cleared a bunker, gunfire erupted from behind. Every advance seemed to trigger fire from unseen angles. The Japanese fought not as individuals, but as extensions of a machine. Faceless, coordinated, unyielding, Sergeant Bill Janoust, who filmed the raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi, wrote in his diary, "We kill them and still they come. They never run. They just die." In those tunnels, death came without warning. Marines would clear one position only to find another 20 feet deeper. And yet amid the horror, a strange respect took root. After capturing enemy letters, translators read words of loyalty, despair, and love, the same emotions that lived in their own hearts. Some Marines began to see the Japanese not as monsters, but as men trapped by duty and deception. By the time Mount Suribachi fell and the flag was raised, over 6,800 Americans were dead. The island was barely half secured. In private, officers admitted what the propaganda never would. If every island is like this, we'll never reach Japan. The Americans' shock was not at Japanese courage. They had seen that before. It was at the depth of preparation, the engineering, and the absolute refusal to surrender even when the outcome was certain. In their enemies, they saw reflections of their own extremes, what any man might become when ordered never to yield. The moral angle. When honor meets oblivion, war tests the limits of morality. But on Iwo Jima, those limits were obliterated. The Japanese Marines had been taught that surrender was worse than death. To them, being captured meant shame for their families, dishonor to the emperor, and disgrace in eternity. So they fought until the last breath, often detonating grenades beneath themselves rather than be taken alive. The Americans, conditioned by earlier atrocities and ambushes, responded with equal ruthlessness. No mercy, no hesitation. Flamethrowers swept through caves, sealing men inside molten rock. Civilians, prisoners, even medics, were often indistinguishable from combatants in the chaos. Survival demanded brutality. The battle blurred the line between humanity and instinct. Each side justified its actions through necessity, one by duty, the other by vengeance and fatigue. And in that crucible, both discovered the true horror of total war, not death itself but the loss of meaning behind it. For Japan, Iwo Jima became a symbol of sacrifice. For America, it became a lesson in cost. When the flag was raised atop Suribachi, it did not signal triumph. It marked the price of victory. Photographs immortalized the moment. But beneath that image lay thousands of unseen dead, buried in the volcanic earth that still smoldered beneath their boots. As the island burned and the sea turned crimson, the stage was set for the war's breaking point, the climax of both strategy and will. The morning of February 19, 1945, began with an illusion. From the decks of U.S. warships, the island appeared dead, smoldering, shattered, silent. For 3 days, the Navy's bombardment had pounded Iwo Jima with over 21,000 tons of shells. Officers believed nothing living could have survived. Then came the order, land the troops. At 9:00 a.m., the first wave of U.S. Marines hit the beaches. The black volcanic sand swallowed their boots and tracks, offering no cover, no traction. Men sank to their knees under the weight of packs and weapons. The air filled with the grind of engines and shouted orders, but still no enemy fire. It was unnerving, the calm before something unimaginable. By 10:00 a.m., thousands of Marines had landed. Tanks rolled ashore. Engineers set up communications, and battalion flags were planted in the ash. Some began to believe the bombardment had truly wiped the defenders out. Then, precisely at 10:15 a.m., the mountain erupted. From hidden artillery chambers on Mount Suribachi, from trenches invisible to reconnaissance planes, from tunnels connecting every ridge, and came the storm. Mortars rained down like molten hail. Machine guns stitched the sand in intersecting arcs. Every inch of beach became a killing ground. Men fell in seconds. Landing craft exploded, bodies hurled into the surf. Officers tried to rally, only to vanish in bursts of fire. The radio chatter dissolved into screams. Those who survived dove into craters, clawing through the ash for cover. "Where's it coming from?" one Marine shouted, but there was no answer. The island itself seemed alive, firing from every direction. In the tunnels beneath them, Japanese Marines of the SNLF's 2nd Yokosuka and 3rd Kure units worked with cold precision. They had rehearsed every target, every range, every gun angle. Spotters relayed coordinates through field telephones. Gunners adjusted fire by the sound of impact, each shell calibrated to kill, not to warn. For the next 36 hours, the beaches became purgatory. By nightfall of the first day, over 2,400 Americans were dead or wounded. The island was less than a mile wide, yet it devoured men as fast as any front in Europe. Kuribayashi's defense worked exactly as designed. Every time the Marines thought they had silenced a position, fire erupted from a new direction. The Japanese moved unseen like phantoms in the smoke. At night, small squads emerged to sabotage tanks and kill sentries with knives. No place was safe, and yet the Americans adapted with grim efficiency. Flamethrowers swept the slopes, tanks blasted cave mouths, and naval guns flattened anything that moved. The Marines' courage was relentless. but their enemy's endurance bordered on inhuman. On February 23rd, after 4 days of blood and confusion, a patrol from the 28th Marine Regiment reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. They raised a small American flag. Below, cheers erupted across the island. For the first time, hope pierced the haze. Moments later, as photographers recorded the scene that would become immortal, Kuribayashi's artillery unleashed another barrage. The battle was far from over. The flag atop Suribachi was not victory, it was defiance. For every yard gained, the Americans paid in blood. The Japanese still held the northern ridges, the real fortress of Iwo Jima, a network of interconnected strongpoints stretching for miles. There, in the volcanic labyrinth, the surviving SNLF units continued to fight, trapped but unbroken. Kuribayashi refused to retreat or surrender. He shifted his command post multiple times, directing resistance until his field phone was destroyed. Even wounded men crawled back to their weapons, firing until they bled out. By March, the island had become a furnace of fire and steel. American tanks advanced only a few hundred yards a day. Flamethrowers ran dry faster than they could be refueled. The smell of sulfur and burned flesh clung to everything. Each night, small pockets of Japanese soldiers, some barely teenagers, launched suicidal counterattacks, emerging from the ground like ghosts. Their screams echoed in the dark, mingling with the gunfire. The thunder of the ships offshore and the cries of the wounded. The U.S. Marines called it hell with the lid off. By the time March 10th arrived, only fragments of organized defense remained. Yet still the shooting continued. Still men fought for caves already buried, for tunnels already collapsed, for orders that could no longer be heard. Kuribayashi's masterpiece of defense had turned a small island into a graveyard for two nations, one powered by faith, the other by industry, and yet, it was only the beginning of the Americans' final shock. By mid-March 1945, Iwo Jima had become a monument to stubbornness. 21,000 Japanese defenders reduced to scattered survivors, but still refusing to yield. American forces controlled most of the island above ground, yet beneath their boots the tunnels still breathed. Every cave mouth was a gun waiting to awaken. It was no longer a battle for territory. It was a battle for finality. Kuribayashi's remaining troops, many from the SNLF, withdrew deep into the island's northern plateau, taking food, water, and ammunition with them. They knew death was certain, but surrender remained unthinkable. In one intercepted radio message, an officer wrote, "The enemy fights with machines, not men. Yet our hearts are still warm and theirs are cold." That coldness was precisely what was about to descend. The Americans unleash total war. The U.S. command had grown frustrated. Weeks of bombardment had failed to extinguish the resistance. So they changed strategy, from attack to eradication. For the first time in Pacific warfare, the U.S. combined artillery coordination, napalm saturation, and mechanized flame armor into one continuous operation. Each morning, flamethrower tanks, Shermans modified into Zippos, advanced in line formation, supported by engineers armed with backpack flamethrowers and demolition charges. Behind them, artillery fire rolled forward like a wave, shells timed to explode just ahead of the advancing line. The goal was no longer to defeat the defenders. It was to sterilize the island. The Japanese Marines had faced fire before, but nothing like this. Napalm, newly refined for thickened burn and cling, poured into cave openings. The flames didn't just ignite, they flowed, crawling along rock, consuming oxygen. Men inside suffocated before they could scream. The tunnels became furnaces, the rock glowing red hot. Marines above heard the muffled thuds as underground chambers collapsed. The stench of burned flesh mixed with sulfur and diesel fumes. When bulldozers sealed the caves, the earth itself seemed to writhe. A Marine officer watching the operation wrote later, "We stopped fighting men. We were fighting a mountain." Even hardened Japanese Marines, veterans of Shanghai, of Hong Kong, were stunned by the scale of destruction. Those who crawled out alive faced a landscape they no longer recognized. Trees gone, air gone, the ground itself aflame. Some Japanese accounts describe it simply, hell above, hell below. The final counterattack by March 25. Only a few hundred Japanese remained alive, scattered in isolated pockets. Kuribayashi, mortally wounded, gathered his final troops and about 300 men in the island's north. Among them were remnants of the SNLF, still wearing faded naval uniforms, bayonets fixed, eyes hollow but unbroken. He gave his last order: "You will advance and die with honor. You will not disgrace your ancestors." That night, under the cover of ash and silence, they moved. Just before dawn, they emerged behind American lines, a coordinated, last-ditch assault on an airfield that the U.S. had already declared secured. They came from nowhere, bursting out of the ground, charging with grenades and swords, bayonets glinting in the first light. For minutes, chaos reigned. Sleeping Marines woke to the sound of gunfire in their own camps. Trucks burned, ammunition exploded, and medics fought hand-to-hand to defend the wounded. When the shooting finally stopped, over 100 Americans were dead. Every Japanese attacker lay among them. It was not a victory. It was a statement that even in annihilation, the spirit of the Emperor's Marines would not vanish quietly. Kuribayashi's body was never definitively identified. Some say he died in that last assault, sword in hand. Others believe he committed suicide in his command post alone. After sending his final message, "I have done all that could be done." When the island fell silent, the Americans stood amid 26,000 of their own casualties, 6,121 dead, 19,000 wounded. The Japanese had lost nearly every man, over 20,000 dead, most buried where they stood. Only 216 prisoners were taken alive. The Marines had captured Iwo Jima, but few felt triumph. In their eyes, it was not victory, it was extinction. The shock beyond the battlefield. When word of the battle reached Japan, disbelief followed. Even among the diehards of the Imperial Navy, the scale of loss was unimaginable. The SNLF, once the pride of the Empire, had been erased in a single campaign. Their courage remained, but their purpose had died. For the Americans, the shock was of another kind. The cost of Iwo Jima forced an unthinkable question. If this tiny island demanded such blood, what would happen when they invaded Japan itself? That question would soon shape the most devastating decision in human history, a weapon born from the same cold logic that burned the tunnels of Iwo Jima. But before that dawn came, the fire had already shown its truth. Honor could no longer stand against machinery. As the smoke lifted and the sea grew quiet, the Marines stood among ruins that looked almost alien, tunnels still steaming, the mountains scorched black. The battle was over, but its echoes would change the world. When the guns finally fell silent on March 26, 1945, the island of Iwo Jima no longer resembled land. It was a wound, blackened, cratered, and smoking. The air still shimmered with heat from days of bombardment. The beaches were a tangle of twisted metal, burned-out tanks, and unburied bodies. The sea, once blue, was streaked with oil and ash. The U.S. Marines had taken the island, but few called it a victory. They called it a burial ground. Nearly 7,000 Americans lay dead, the highest toll in any single battle in Marine Corps history. Another 19,000 were wounded, many for life. The Japanese losses defied comprehension. Out of 21,000 defenders, only 216 were captured alive. The rest had fought, burned, or buried themselves to death. Military historians would later call Iwo Jima a strategic necessity, but for those who survived, strategy was meaningless. The cost had been too great. Sergeant Major Iron Mike Mervosh of the 4th Marines said years later, "You don't win a battle like that. You just come out alive." In the weeks that followed, U.S. engineers turned the ruins into an airfield. Within days, crippled B-29 superfortresses returning from bombing raids over Japan began landing there. For the pilots, Iwo Jima was salvation, a strip of volcanic earth that turned death into survival. For the men who had fought for it, it was something else entirely, a place haunted by the screams of both friend and foe. Letters home captured the mood. One Marine wrote, "We've seen the face of hell and it had no mercy." Another simply said, "I left part of myself there, and I don't mean my leg." On the Japanese side, news of the defeat arrived slowly. Tokyo radio did not announce the fall of Iwo Jima until weeks later. The official statement called it a heroic sacrifice for the Emperor, avoiding mention of annihilation. Privately, naval officers wept. The loss of the SNLF, once the Empire's elite, struck at Japan's soul. For years they had been the symbol of invincibility. Now they existed only in ashes. In their place stood a grim realization. Japan could no longer defend its empire, not even the islands nearest its own shores. The Imperial Navy had been reduced to a shadow. The army bled dry in China and the Philippines, and yet no surrender came. The nation's leaders clung to a single belief, that they could still make America bleed enough to seek peace on Japan's terms. But Iwo Jima shattered that illusion. The Americans had proven they would pay any price to finish the war. Each beachhead, each mountain, each tunnel burned taught the same lesson. The United States would not stop until Japan ceased to exist as a military power. When word of the battle reached Okinawa, Japan's last major defensive line, soldiers and civilians alike understood what awaited them. They fortified caves, stockpiled explosives, and whispered prayers to ancestors. They knew the Americans were coming, and they knew what the fire would bring. By the time the last bodies were buried, Iwo Jima had claimed over 46,000 lives. It was a name that echoed through barracks and temples alike, a symbol of valor, futility, and the death of illusion. But the real transformation was just beginning, not in the battlefield's ashes, but in the minds of those who witnessed it. What came next would redefine the meaning of destruction itself. In the months following Iwo Jima, the war's momentum accelerated toward apocalypse. The island's capture was hailed in Washington as a necessary victory, a stepping stone to the Japanese mainland. But among the men who had fought there, the triumph felt hollow. They had witnessed what it truly meant to conquer an empire built on death before surrender. For America's military planners, Iwo Jima was a brutal equation. If 20,000 Japanese defenders could kill nearly 7,000 Marines, then an invasion of Japan, defended by millions, could cost 1 million Allied lives. Every officer understood it. Every survivor feared it. That fear reached the highest offices in Washington. Reports from Iwo Jima described Japanese troops refusing to surrender, even when surrounded, wounded, and starving. Captured diaries spoke of honor, emperor, and the wish to die beautifully. To U.S. strategists, this was not courage, it was fanaticism. And it meant that the normal rules of war no longer applied. In Tokyo, the loss of Iwo Jima was both military and spiritual. For the first time, the homeland lay exposed. American bombers now launched from its airfields daily, their silver wings crossing the dawn to drop fire on cities below. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, all burned in waves of napalm raids that killed tens of thousands overnight. What had begun as a war of honor became a war of survival. The SNLF, Japan's once elite Marines, were gone. Their graves unmarked, their names remembered only in whispered prayers. Families received no bodies, only telegrams that read, "He died gloriously in battle." For a culture built on the ideal of noble death, even grief had become ritualized, yet beneath the slogans a quiet despair spread. Letters intercepted by Allied intelligence revealed soldiers questioning the Emperor's divine will. Mothers wondered aloud if their sons had died in vain. The fire from Iwo Jima had not only consumed men, it had begun to burn through the myth of invincibility itself. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the next target awaited: Okinawa. If Iwo Jima had been a fortress, Okinawa was an empire in miniature. Civilians, soldiers, and suicide planes intertwined in a single catastrophe. It was there in April 1945 that America's worst fears came true. Japanese forces fought to the last, and tens of thousands of civilians died alongside them. The vision of invasion became unbearable. In July, as Okinawa's smoke still rose, President Harry Truman received word of a weapon unlike any in history: the atomic bomb. To him, the lessons of Iwo Jima were still raw: an enemy that refused surrender, a battlefield where fire alone ended resistance, and the unimaginable cost of continuing the old way of war. When he authorized the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he did so in the shadow of that volcanic island. For Japan, the surrender that followed was not only political, it was spiritual collapse. The Emperor's voice, trembling over the radio, told his people to endure the unendurable. In that moment, the nation's centuries-old code of death before defeat gave way to silence. And yet, among the ashes of Tokyo and the tunnels of Iwo Jima, a strange continuity remained. The courage of those who fought, on both sides, would shape generations of soldiers to come. American Marines would study Kuribayashi's defenses for decades, calling them a masterclass in terrain warfare. Japan, in rebuilding its future, would look upon the valor of its fallen not as a call to arms, but as a warning against blind devotion. When peace finally came, Iwo Jima remained sacred ground. The bones of over 10,000 Japanese soldiers were never recovered. The mountain still breathes, sulfur vents whispering through the soil, as if the island itself remembers. In that silence, the echoes of both victory and tragedy still linger, reminding the world that in war, the line between heroism and horror is as thin as a blade drawn in ash. Today, Iwo Jima lies quiet. The sea that once ran red is calm again, the black sand glistening under Pacific sun. Wind sweeps across the slopes of Mount Suribachi, carrying the faint scent of sulfur, the same air the men once breathed in terror and defiance. There are no gunshots now, no voices shouting orders, only silence, and memory that silence is not peace. It is witness. Beneath the ground rest the remains of over 20,000 Japanese soldiers, Marines, laborers, officers, still entombed in the tunnels they built. They fought for an empire that no longer exists, under a flag that would fall within months. But their courage, their discipline, and their willingness to die together transformed the island into something eternal. A symbol not of victory, but of the cost of belief. For the Americans who survived, Iwo Jima became a lifelong shadow. They carried home not just wounds, but questions. About purpose, about humanity, about what it means to win when so much is lost. The iconic photograph of 6 Marines raising the flag captured triumph for a nation, but it also concealed the truth that the war's greatest horror was still ahead. Iwo Jima marked the end of one kind of warfare and the birth of another. From swords and honor to machines and fire, the battle revealed the transformation of humanity itself, from warriors to weapons. When the atomic bomb fell later that year, it was not born in isolation. It was born in the flames of places like this, and yet amid that desolation the human spirit endured. Because every soldier, Japanese or American, fought believing he was defending something sacred. Their reasons were different, but their sacrifice was the same. So the island stands today, half shrine, half grave, a reminder that courage and tragedy often share the same heartbeat. And in the hush that follows war, the world still listens to the silence beneath the ash.